a skull dipped in molten gold, its hollow eyes staring through a century of broken dreams. 10,000 swords that never bent, never broke, carried by men who sold their blades but never their souls. They called themselves the Golden Company, and for 112 years they kept a promise that seemed impossible. They never broke a contract. Not once, not ever, until the day they did. This is the story of exiled bastards who became legends, of noble blood denied its birthright, of sons raised to fight for a home they would never see, carrying the fury of their fathers like a banner into every battle. It is a tale of loyalty so fierce it survived generations, of an oath whispered in defeat that echoed louder than victory, of golden skulls watching over the living, demanding they remember what was promised in blood. But here is what haunts the history books. After 100 years of perfect honor, after building a reputation that made kings trust them and enemies fear them, they shattered their sacred word. They betrayed a contract. They destroyed everything they had built, and they did it to go home. Why would the most honorable sellswords in history become oathbreakers? What promise was strong enough to make them sacrifice their legendary reputation, and what dark secret might they be hiding about the prince they followed across the narrow sea? Tonight we journey into one of the most fascinating military stories in the history of Westeros and Essos, the Golden Company. An army of exiles who turned displacement into legend, who made honor profitable in a world built on betrayal. Now before we begin, I need to share something. Nearly 84% of people watching this video right now are not subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy deep dives into Game of Thrones history, into the untold stories lurking in the shadows of the main narrative, then please hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. Also, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I absolutely love seeing the global community that gathers here for these stories. Now dim those lights if you can. Get comfortable under your blanket. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound. And let's travel back through time to witness how bitterness and gold forged the greatest mercenary company the world has ever known. In the world of ice and fire, where dragons once ruled the skies and ancient houses battled for dominance, there existed a peculiar truth. The most dangerous armies were not always the ones with crowns. Sometimes, the deadliest forces were the ones with nothing left to lose. Our story begins in the year 196 after Aegon's conquest, in the aftermath of a civil war that tore Westeros apart. The first Blackfire Rebellion had just ended in blood and defeat on a field of red grass. Daemon Blackfire, the charismatic bastard who dared to claim the Iron Throne, lay dead with 6 arrows in him. His supporters were scattered, broken, hunted. The rebellion was crushed. The dream was finished. But there was one man who refused to bend. Agor Rivers, called Bittersteel, stood among the ruins of that dream with a choice before him. He could kneel, beg forgiveness, and live a diminished life in the kingdom that had defeated him. Or he could take the sword from his fallen king's hand, gather those who still believed, and cross the narrow sea into exile. He chose the sea. He chose fury over forgiveness, and in that choice, he planted the seed of a legend that would outlive him by a century. Across the water in the free cities of Essos, where coins mattered more than bloodlines, and sellswords were as common as merchants, Bittersteel built something unprecedented. Not just a mercenary company, but an army of displaced nobility, knights without lands, lords without halls, sons of great houses who carried their heraldry into foreign wars, who maintained the chivalric codes of Westeros while fighting for Essosi gold. They called themselves the Golden Company, and they were like no sellsword force the world had ever seen. At their height, 10,000 strong, they marched with war elephants from Volantis, creatures that trumpeted like thunder and crushed castle gates beneath their massive feet. They accepted payment only in gold, never in land or titles, because they had no intention of putting down roots in Essos. They were temporary residents in a foreign land, always preparing, always saving, always training for the day they would return. Their camps stretched like mobile cities across the disputed lands, a patchwork of territories constantly fought over by Mir, Lys, and Tyrosh. Golden banners snapped in the wind above pavilions where exiled lords still ate with the etiquette of Westerosi courts. The clang of training swords mixed with songs of home, ballads about castles and forests and kingdoms that many of the younger soldiers had never seen but somehow still missed. And in the center of every camp stood a tent unlike any other. The skull tent, where the gilded heads of dead captains watched over the living with hollow golden eyes, silent witnesses to an oath that bound the company tighter than any contract ever could. Some promises are written in ink on parchment, others are written in blood and bone and bitter memory. The Golden Company carried both. To understand the Golden Company, you must first understand the man who forged it from rage and loss. Agorda Rivers was the fourth baseborn son of King Aegon IV, a monarch so notoriously lecherous that history remembers him as Aegon the Unworthy. The king fathered at least 9 bastards that the realm knew of, possibly more that died unknown. But 4 of these children mattered. 4 of them were given the name Rivers and raised at court with the king's legitimate children. 4 of them would shape the destiny of Westeros for generations. Aegon was not the eldest of these great bastards, nor was he the most loved. That distinction belonged to Daemon Blackfyre, a golden son with silver hair and purple eyes, a warrior of exceptional skill and legendary charm. King Aegon doted on Daemon, gave him a Valyrian steel sword called Blackfyre that had been carried by Targaryen kings since Aegon the Conqueror himself. It was an act of favor so extreme that many whispered it meant Daemon, not the legitimate Prince Daeron, would inherit the throne. Aegon loved Daemon as a brother. More than that, he loved Daemon's sister Calla with a devotion that consumed him. But that love remained unconsummated, unfulfilled, a source of eternal frustration, and he hated with equal passion. His half-brother Brynden Rivers, called Bloodraven for the red birthmark that covered half his face, became the target of all Aegon's bile. Both bastards, both brilliant, both serving House Targaryen, but on opposite sides of history's greatest divide. When Daemon Blackfyre rose in rebellion against King Daeron II in the year 196, claiming the throne as his birthright, Aegon stood with him without hesitation. Brynden stood with the king. The realm tore itself apart. Great houses chose sides. Father fought son. Brother killed brother. The carnage spread across the 7 kingdoms like wildfire, until it all came to a head on a battlefield that would be remembered forever. The Redgrass Field earned its name that day. The grass truly did run red with blood. Daemon Blackfyre led a charge so fierce that victory seemed certain. He cut through royal forces like a man possessed, the Valyrian steel sword singing in his hands. For a moment, for one shining moment, the Iron Throne seemed within reach. Then the arrows came, 6 of them, fired by Bloodraven or his elite archers called the Raven's Teeth. Daemon fell from his horse. The rebellion died with him in that field. Agorda Rivers fought on even as the cause collapsed around him. He pushed through enemy lines to where Daemon lay dying, took the Blackfyre sword from his fallen friend's hand, and made a choice that would echo through a century. He refused to surrender. He refused to kneel. He gathered Daemon's young twin sons, barely more than children, and those lords still willing to follow a lost cause. Together they fled to the coast, commandeered ships, and sailed into exile. The narrow sea crossing was brutal. Many ships were lost to storms. Men who had been lords in Westeros huddled below decks, seasick and despairing, watching everything they knew disappear behind them. But Agor stood at the prow, the black fire sword strapped to his back, staring toward Essos with eyes that held no tears, only fury, only iron determination. The realm would remember him as Bittersteel, and that name fit him perfectly. There was nothing soft in him anymore. The defeat at Redgrass Field had burned away whatever gentleness he possessed. They landed in the free cities as broken men, penniless nobility, with nothing but their swords and their pride. The exiled lords expected to live as beggars or fade into obscurity. Bittersteel had other plans. Within months of their arrival, he began recruiting, not just the Westerosi exiles, but any man who could fight and follow orders. He trained them with Westerosi discipline, taught them to fight in formation rather than as individual sellswords. He created structure where other companies had chaos. The Golden Company was born from this vision. Bittersteel understood something that other sellsword captains did not. In Essos, where loyalty shifted with the highest bidder and contracts were broken as easily as promises to tavern wenches, a company that never betrayed its employers would be worth its weight in gold. Literally, he established the policy immediately. The Golden Company would only accept gold as payment. No land in Essos, no titles from free cities, no promises of future rewards. Gold, hard currency they could save, could hoard, could eventually use to fund an invasion of Westeros. More importantly, he demanded absolute adherence to contracts. Once the Golden Company gave its word, that word became sacred. Other sellsword companies would switch sides mid-battle if someone offered more coin. The Golden Company would die before breaking faith. It was not mercy or kindness that drove this policy. It was strategy. A reputation for reliability meant higher fees. Higher fees meant faster accumulation of wealth. Wealth meant an army that could one day sail home. The motto came naturally. Beneath the gold, the bitter steel. On the surface, they were mercenaries fighting for coin like any others. Underneath, they were exiles sharpening their blades for vengeance. But Bittersteel added one more tradition that set them apart from every other fighting force in the known world. When the first captain of the company died in battle, Bittersteel had his skull cleaned and dipped in molten gold. The gilded skull was placed in a tent at the center of camp. When the next captain died, his skull joined the first, and the next, and the next. The dead would watch over the living. They would bear witness to every oath sworn, every contract signed, every decision made. No commander could forget the weight of those hollow golden eyes staring at him, reminding him that death did not end service to the company. The skull tent became the heart of the Golden Company. New recruits were brought there to swear their oaths. Officers met there to discuss strategy. And in that tent, surrounded by the gilded heads of fallen brothers, every man understood the truth. This was not temporary employment. This was a blood bond that lasted beyond the grave. In those early years, the Golden Company fought in the endless wars of the disputed lands. The territories between Maya, Lys, and Tyrosh changed hands so frequently that no map could keep accurate borders. It was perfect work for sellswords. Plenty of contracts, plenty of gold, plenty of opportunities to build a fearsome reputation. The Golden Company won battles through superior discipline and Westerosi tactics. They honored every contract to the letter. Word spread quickly. If you hired the Golden Company, they would fulfill their obligation or die in the attempt. But every man in the company knew the gold they earned was not theirs to spend freely. It was being saved, hoarded, invested in the dream of return. Bittersteel drilled this into them constantly. They were not sellswords. They were exiles preparing for restoration. Every coin brought them closer to home. The years after the founding were not glorious. They were hard, grinding, relentless. Bittersteel drove his men with an intensity that bordered on cruelty. He accepted nothing less than perfection in training. Soldiers who failed to meet standards were dismissed without ceremony. Officers who showed cowardice were stripped of rank. The company operated with military precision that sword forces rarely achieved. By the year 211, 15 years after their founding, the Golden Company had grown from a few hundred desperate exiles to nearly 4,000 disciplined soldiers. They had fought in dozens of conflicts, never losing a battle they were contracted to win. Their reputation had spread to every free city, to Volantis and Bravos, even to the distant cities of Slavers Bay. When the Golden Company gave its word, that word held weight. But Bittersteel never forgot the true purpose. In 211, word reached Essos that another Blackfire rebellion had begun in Westeros. Daemon's son, also named Daemon, had come of age and claimed his father's throne, the Second Rebellion. Bittersteel wanted desperately to transport the entire Golden Company across the Narrow Sea, to land 10,000 swords on Westerosi soil and fight for the cause he had never abandoned. The logistics proved impossible. Ships capable of transporting such a force did not exist in sufficient numbers. The cost would have bankrupted them. Instead, Bittersteel sent gold weapons and a cadre of officers to help organize the rebel forces. He paced the docks of Tyrosh like a caged animal waiting for news, praying for victory. The news, when it came, was devastating. Daemon the Seeker and his brother Aemon had been murdered. Not killed in honorable battle, but slain under a peace banner, while negotiating with their enemies. Treachery, betrayal. The Peake family, supposed allies, had arranged their deaths to curry favor with the Iron Throne. The Second Rebellion died in dishonor and blood. Bittersteel's rage after hearing this news was legendary. Men who witnessed it said he did not sleep for 3 days, pacing through camp, his hand never leaving the hilt of the Blackfire sword. He swore oaths so terrible that veterans of a dozen battles flinched at hearing them. But more importantly, his determination hardened into something unbreakable. If it took 50 years, if it took 100, the Golden Company would return to Westeros. This he promised to the skulls in their tent. This he promised to every man under his command. The company continued to grow. By 219, they numbered close to 6,000. Bittersteel began acquiring something that would become their signature advantage: war elephants. He negotiated with Volantene merchants and generals, trading victories for the massive beasts. Elephants were worth fortunes, difficult to maintain, nearly impossible to train for warfare, but Bittersteel understood their value. An elephant crashing through enemy lines was worth 100 men. The sight of them terrified soldiers who had never seen such creatures. The Golden Company became one of the few Western military forces to successfully incorporate elephants into their battle tactics. That same year, the Third Blackfire Rebellion erupted. Hagon Blackfire, another son of the first Daemon, made his attempt at the throne. This time, Bittersteel was determined to bring the full might of the Golden Company to bear. He assembled a fleet in Tyrosh, loaded 6,000 soldiers and their equipment, and set sail for Westeros. The invasion never materialized. Dornish ships intercepted them at sea. Storms scattered the fleet. Only a fraction of the Golden Company reached Westerosi shores, and those who did were quickly defeated by prepared royal forces. Hagon escaped back to Essos, but the dream of restoration seemed more distant than ever. Bittersteel was in his 50s now, his hair turning silver, his face lined with decades of disappointment. But he never wavered. He rebuilt the company. After each setback, he maintained discipline. He kept the contracts flowing and the gold accumulating, and he continued to enforce the traditions that made the Golden Company unique. Soldiers born in Essos, who had never seen Westeros, were taught about the 7 kingdoms as if they were studying scripture. They learned the great houses, the regions, the customs. They practiced Westerosi military formations. They maintained personal heraldry, even though they fought as common sellswords. Sons and grandsons of the original exiles grew up believing they would someday go home, even though home was a place they knew only through songs and stories. The company's reputation for honoring contracts became legendary through a single incident. They were fighting for Mai against Lyses when midway through the campaign, Lyses offered them triple payment to switch sides. Triple. The gold would have been staggering. The Myrish forces were losing badly, and many in the company argued they should take the better offer. Bittersteel refused without hesitation. The Golden Company had given its word to Mir. That word was not negotiable at any price. They fought on, took terrible casualties, and ultimately lost that war. But the story spread across Essos faster than any victory could have. The Golden Company would rather die than break faith. After that, their fees increased dramatically. Employers knew that once the Golden Company committed, they were committed absolutely. In 236, the Fourth Blackfire Rebellion began. Daemon III, grandson of the first Daemon, landed in Westeros with a portion of the Golden Company. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. Some houses declared for him. Momentum built. Men whispered that perhaps this time, after 40 years, the Blackfire cause would succeed. Then Lord Commander Duncan the Tall, the legendary Kingsguard who had once been a hedge knight, led the royal response. Duncan was a giant of a man, supposedly 7 feet tall, and a tactical genius despite his common birth. He outmaneuvered the rebel forces, cut off their supply lines, and captured Daemon III alive. The young Blackfire pretender was brought to King's Landing in chains and publicly executed. Another heir, dead. Another rebellion crushed. Bittersteel, now in his 70s, received the news in Essos. Those who saw him said he seemed to age a decade in that moment, but he gathered the company and told them the fight would continue. It had to continue. Too many had died for the cause to abandon it. Now, 5 years later, in 241, Igor Bittersteel Rivers died. He was 80 years old, had spent 45 years leading the Golden Company, and never once returned to Westeros. His last words, witnessed by the captains gathered around his deathbed, were simple: keep the swords sharp, keep the faith. One day you will go home. His skull was gilded and placed in the tent of honor, positioned so that all who entered would see it first. Bittersteel in death, as in life, would watch over the company he built from bitterness and iron will. The soldiers wept that night, not because they loved him, though many did. They wept because the founder, the man who had walked with Daemon Blackfire, who had fought at Redgrass Field, who embodied everything the company stood for, had died in exile without seeing his dream fulfilled. But the Golden Company did not dissolve. It did not fracture. The traditions were too deeply rooted. A new commander was chosen. The contracts continued. And somewhere in Essos, young men who had never known Westeros still trained to fight for a homeland they inherited through songs. The history of the Blackfire rebellions reads like a tragic epic, each chapter more desperate than the last. 5 times across 7 decades, the Black Dragon banner rose against the Red. 5 times it fell, and through all of it, the Golden Company stood as the military arm of a cause that refused to die, even when logic demanded it should. After Bittersteel's death, the company passed through several commanders. Good men, competent soldiers, but none with the founder's burning intensity. They maintained the standards he established. They honored every contract. They continued saving gold for an invasion that seemed increasingly unlikely. The company was now an institution, self-sustaining and self-perpetuating. Men who joined did so knowing they might spend their entire lives waiting for a return to Westeros that would never come in their lifetime. In 260, everything changed. The last male heir of House Blackfire emerged from obscurity. His name was Maelys, and he was called the Monstrous for good reason. A second head grew from his neck. a malformed thing with a twisted face that seemed to whisper in his ear. Whether this secondary head was truly alive, or simply a grotesque growth, remained a subject of horrified speculation. What was certain was that Meles possessed strength beyond natural limits, and a cruelty that made hardened soldiers uneasy. Meles had seized his position as Blackfire heir by murdering his cousin, another claimant, in single combat. It was not an honorable duel, it was a brutal beating that ended with Meles crushing the other man's skull with his bare hands. The Golden Company, desperate for any Blackfire heir after decades without one, accepted him. They had little choice. Without a pretender to rally around, they were just another sellsword company. With Meles they had purpose again. That same year, a confederation formed that would shake the political foundations of Westeros and Essos alike. 9 adventurers, pirates, and sellsword commanders came together with the audacious plan. They would conquer the Stepstones, the chain of rocky islands between the 2 continents, and use them as a base to extort trade passing through the shipping lanes. They called themselves the Band of 9. Meles the Monstrous became the military commander of this alliance. The Golden Company, 10,000 strong with dozens of war elephants, formed the core of their army. Other commanders brought their own forces, their own fleets, their own ambitions, but for Meles and the Golden Company, the Stepstones were just a stepping stone. The real prize was Westeros itself. The Band of 9 swept through the Stepstones with brutal efficiency. Island after island fell. Pirates who had held these rocks for generations were slaughtered or driven off. Fortifications were built, supply depots established. Within months the band controlled the strategic choke point between continents. Every ship passing through paid tribute or was seized. Trade routes that had existed for centuries were disrupted. The Iron Throne could not ignore such a direct threat. More than that, the young lords of Westeros saw an opportunity for glory. This was a chance to prove themselves in war without the moral complexity of fighting fellow Westerosi. The expedition that sailed for the Stepstones included some of the most notable names of the generation. Young Tywin Lannister, heir to Casterly Rock, determined to prove he was nothing like his weak father. Barristan Selmy, already knighted but hungry to earn true renown. Steffon Baratheon, father of the future King Robert. The finest knights and soldiers of the 7 kingdoms mobilized for what would be called the War of the 9 Epenny Kings. The fighting that followed was vicious beyond what either side anticipated. The Stepstones are not verdant islands with flat beaches. They are rocky outcrops thrust up from the sea, covered in sharp stone and narrow passages. Every island had to be taken individually. Every fortress required a separate siege. The Golden Company, experienced in every form of warfare from open field battles to urban combat, made the Westerosi forces pay in blood for every foot of ground. The war elephants proved both advantage and liability in the narrow confines of island fortresses. They were devastating. Walls crumbled under their weight, gates splintered, soldiers fled in terror. But the rocky terrain was treacherous for such massive beasts. Several fell from cliffs or broke legs in hidden crevasses. The company lost nearly half their elephants in the campaign, a blow to their prestige and tactical capabilities. For months, the war ground on. Neither side could gain decisive advantage. The Westerosi had numbers and a constant supply line to the mainland. The Golden Company had defensive positions and decades of experience. The seas around the Stepstones turned red with blood from naval battles. The rocks themselves were scarred with the marks of siege weapons. Then came the duel that ended it all. On one of the central islands, the main forces met in open battle. The Golden Company formed their disciplined lines. The Westerosi charged with the fury of knights seeking glory. In the chaos of combat, Meles the Monstrous and Barristan Selmy found each other. Accounts of the duel vary, depending on who tells it. Westerosi bards make it sound like a contest between good and evil, the noble knight against the twisted monster. The Sosi sources suggest it was a brutal struggle between two exceptional warriors. What no one disputes is that Barristan Selmy, barely 20 years old, faced a man who had killed dozens in single combat and possessed freakish strength. The fight was quick. Meleys swung a massive morning star that could have crushed armor and bones together. Barristan was faster, younger, trained by the finest masters in Westeros. He dodged the heavy blows, waited for an opening, and struck with precision. His sword entered through Meleys' left eye and exited through the back of his skull, splitting both the main head and the secondary growth that had earned him his epithet. The last male Blackfire heir died on the stepstones. With his death, the Band of Nine fell apart. The Golden Company, leaderless and facing overwhelming odds, retreated to their ships and sailed back to Essos. The Westerosi forces hunted down the remaining pirates and sellswords, reclaimed the islands, and returned home as heroes. For the Golden Company, the defeat was catastrophic. They had lost thousands of men, half their elephants were dead. Their reputation for never losing a contract they committed to was badly damaged. And most devastating of all, the male line of House Blackfire was extinct. There were female descendants, distant cousins with Blackfire blood, but no legitimate male heir to claim the throne. The company faced an existential crisis. For 64 years, they had fought for the Blackfire cause. It was the reason they existed, the justification for all their traditions and sacrifices. Without that cause, what were they? Just another sellsword company with strange customs and an expensive operating budget. The captains gathered in the skull tent, surrounded by over 100 gilded heads. Bittersteel's skull stared at them from its place of honor. The debate raged for days. Some argued they should disband, take their accumulated wealth, and retire as rich men. Others insisted the oath was not to Blackfire specifically, but to return to Westeros. They could wait for another opportunity, another cause, another pretender. In the end, tradition won. The Golden Company would continue. They would maintain their standards, honor their contracts, and wait for what? They were not entirely sure, but they had come too far, sacrificed too much, to simply give up and fade into history. The years after the War of the Ninepenny Kings were strange ones for the company. They fought in the usual conflicts of the disputed lands. They defended Maya against Volantane expansion. They served briefly in employ of Braavos, but something fundamental had changed. The ideological fire that Bittersteel had kindled and that had burned for 3 generations was reduced to embers. Younger members began to question the old oaths. Why not accept land in Essos? Why not settle down, marry, build something permanent? Many had been born in the free cities and had never seen Westeros. The promise to return home seemed increasingly hollow when home was a place they knew only through stories. The older veterans held firm. They told the same stories they had been told. They sang the same songs. They pointed to the skull tent and reminded everyone of the oaths sworn by men long dead but never forgotten. The Golden Company's identity was bound up in their unique position. They were not like other sellswords. They were exiles waiting to go home. To abandon that was to abandon everything that made them special. In 283, another upheaval shook Westeros. Robert Baratheon rose in rebellion against the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen. The realm erupted in what would be called Robert's Rebellion. The war was brutal and decisive. Robert's warhammer crushed Prince Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident. King's Landing fell to Lannister treachery. The Targaryen dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years was overthrown. The surviving Targaryen children, Viserys and his infant sister Daenerys, fled across the narrow sea into exile. They landed in the free cities as refugees, hunted by assassins, dependent on the charity of merchants and minor nobles. They were, in essence, in the same position that the Blackfire supporters had occupied a century earlier. The Golden Company watched this development with intense interest. Some captains proposed offering their services to the exiled Targaryens. After all, both groups wanted to retake Westeros from a usurper. Both had legitimate claims to the throne, at least by certain interpretations. An alliance seemed natural. But old hatreds die hard. The Golden Company had been founded to fight against House Targaryen. Bittersteel had spent his life opposing them. Many of the older members felt it would be a betrayal of everything they stood for to suddenly switch sides and support the dynasty they had rebelled against. The debate went nowhere. The company remained neutral, continuing to take contracts in Essos, while the Targaryen children grew up in exile. But the question had been raised: without Blackfire, what was their purpose? If return to Westeros was truly the goal, did it matter which claimant they supported? These questions would simmer for years, until a brilliant commander named Miles Toyne took control of the Golden Company and changed everything. The decades following the War of the Ninepenny Kings marked a peculiar chapter in the Golden Company's history. They continued to operate with the same iron discipline, the same unwavering commitment to contracts, the same traditions that had defined them for generations. Yet something essential had been hollowed out. They were a machine still running perfectly, but now without clear destination. The contracts came steadily. The disputed lands never lacked for war. Mar needed soldiers to push back Volantene expansion attempts. Lyes hired them to raid Taroshi shipping. Taroshi employed them to defend against both neighbors simultaneously. The Golden Company marched from one conflict to another, their golden banners becoming as familiar in Essos as the changing seasons. They won battles. They accumulated wealth. They maintained their reputation for absolute reliability. But the purpose that had once animated every action had evaporated. When Bittersteel founded the company, every coin earned was a step toward reclaiming Westeros. Every battle was training for the real war. Every new recruit was another sword for the invasion. Now they were simply sellswords with expensive traditions. The younger generation felt this absence most acutely. These were men born in Pentos, raised in Myr, trained in the disputed lands. Westeros was not home to them. It was a foreign land they knew only through songs their grandfathers had taught them. When the older veterans spoke of returning to castles and keeps, the younger soldiers heard stories about places that might as well be mythical. Why save gold for an invasion of a kingdom that did not want them when they could spend that wealth building lives in Essos? The arguments happened in quiet corners of camps, away from the skull tent, where such doubts felt like blasphemy. Some suggested they should finally accept land offers from grateful free cities. Others wondered if they should simply divide the accumulated treasure and disband. Each man could retire wealthy, marry, settle into a peaceful life. The older members crushed these suggestions whenever they surfaced. They pointed to the skull tent, to the 100 and more gilded heads watching silently. They invoked Bittersteel's name. They recited the old oaths. But their arguments were weakening. How long could you demand loyalty to a promise made by dead men for a cause that no longer existed? The company fought in a brief but profitable campaign for Braavos in 270, helping the secret city defend against Pentoshi aggression. 2 years later, they were back in the disputed lands, this time preventing Mai from being absorbed entirely by Volantis. In 278, they spent 18 months garrisoning Lys during a period of internal political chaos, essentially serving as the backbone of civil order, while aristocrats murdered each other in elaborate palace intrigues. These were not glorious campaigns. They were jobs, professional, well-executed, profitable jobs, but they were not steps toward anything greater. The Golden Company had become exactly what Bittersteel had fought so hard to prevent. They were sellswords. Skilled, honorable, expensive sellswords, but sellswords nonetheless. Then, in 283, news arrived that changed the equation entirely. Robert Baratheon had overthrown House Targaryen, the dragon dynasty that had ruled since Aegon's conquest was finished. King Aerys II, the Mad King, was dead. Prince Rhaegar was dead. The royal children had been murdered, or so the reports claimed. Only 2 Targaryen survivors remained. Prince Viserys, a boy of 7 or 8, and his infant sister Daenerys, smuggled across the narrow sea by loyalists. The Golden Company leadership watched these developments with fascination and confusion. Here were exiled Targaryens, dispossessed by rebellion, living as refugees in the free cities. The parallels to their own history were impossible to ignore. These children were in the exact position that Dedemon Blackfire's sons had been in over a century ago. Some captains immediately proposed making contact. An alliance seemed logical. Both groups wanted to retake Westeros from a usurper. Both had claims to legitimacy. Together, they might actually succeed where each alone would fail. But the proposal died in debate. The Golden Company had been founded to fight Targaryens, not serve them. Every skull in that tent had belonged to a man who died opposing the Red Dragon. How could they now raise that banner without betraying everything? So they did nothing. They watched the young Targaryen exiles move from city to city, growing up poor and hunted. They continued taking contracts, accumulating gold, maintaining traditions that felt increasingly meaningless. And they waited, though, for what even they could no longer clearly articulate. The company needed someone with vision, someone who could redefine their purpose without abandoning their identity. Someone who understood that sometimes the most important traditions are the ones you have the wisdom to adapt. That person was coming. His name was Miles Toyne, and he would earn the title Blackheart. Leadership of the Golden Company passed through many hands across the decades, each commander adding his skull to the growing collection in that haunted tent. Most of these men were competent soldiers and adequate administrators. They maintained standards, honored contracts, kept the company profitable and disciplined. History remembers their tenure only as dates between more significant events. But 3 commanders mattered. 3 shaped the company's destiny in ways that echoed long after their deaths. A keg of Bittersteel Rivers requires no further examination. His 45 years of leadership created the Golden Company from nothing but rage and determination. Every tradition, every policy, every aspect of what made them unique flowed from his embittered genius. When he died in 241, having never returned to Westeros, his gilded skull became the spiritual center of the company. Future commanders entered that tent, knowing Bittersteel's hollow eyes watched their every decision, judging whether they maintained his standards or let them decay. The commanders who followed through the middle decades were steady hands in unremarkable times. They fought the necessary wars, earned the necessary gold, and kept the company together through its crisis of purpose after Meleys the Monstrous fell. These men understood that sometimes leadership means simply preserving an institution until someone with actual vision can take the reins. Their skulls filled the tent, anonymous golden witnesses to history they helped maintain but did not make. Then came Miles Toyne. The date of his assuming command is uncertain, but by the late 280s after Aegon's conquest, he had become Captain General. Soldiers called him Blackheart, supposedly for the black armor and banner he favored, though some whispered it referenced a harder, darker interior. If Bittersteel was fury made flesh, Blackheart was calculation wearing human form. He possessed the rarest combination of qualities: absolute pragmatism married to idealistic vision, the ability to honor tradition while recognizing when circumstances demanded adaptation. Blackheart looked at the Golden Company's situation with clear eyes. No male Blackfire heirs existed. The cause that had justified their existence was dead. Yet the company still held tremendous assets: 10,000 disciplined soldiers, decades of institutional knowledge, a reputation for reliability that commanded premium prices. Most importantly, accumulated wealth sufficient to fund a major military operation. All this power sat idle, waiting for purpose. He also observed the exiled Targaryens with interest. The Zeres and Daenerys, growing up poor in Pentos and Bravos, represented opportunity. They wanted their throne back. They had a claim recognized by significant portions of Westeros, particularly Dorne, where rage over Elia Martell's murder still burned hot. But they had no army, no resources, no realistic path to power. Blackheart began cultivating relationships with Targaryen loyalists. He befriended Willem Darry, the old knight who had smuggled the children to safety. Through Darry, he made contact with agents of Prince Doran Martell, the cautious but vengeful ruler of Dorne. Slowly, carefully, a network formed, not a conspiracy exactly, but a web of mutual interests waiting for the right moment to crystallize into action. The crucial partnership was with Illyrio Mopatis, the enormously wealthy magister of Pentos. Illyrio was a contradiction wrapped in silk robes, a merchant who played at politics, a man of humble origins who now commanded resources that rivaled some free cities. His motivations remained opaque. Some believed he was a Targaryen loyalist driven by ideology. Others suspected he had Blackfire blood himself, or that his late wife Sarah had carried that lineage. Perhaps he simply recognized a profitable opportunity. Whatever his reasons, Illyrio had money, connections, and willingness to invest in long-term schemes. Together, Blackheart and Illyrio crafted a plan of breathtaking scope. Marry Viserys Targaryen to Arianne Martell, heir to Dorne. The marriage would unite Targaryen claim with Dornish military support. The Golden Company would provide the invasion force. When the time was right, they would land in Dorne, march north with Martell spears behind them, and retake the Seven Kingdoms. A formal pact was signed in secret, likely in Bravos around 295. Dornish representatives, Golden Company officers, and Targaryen loyalists put their names to a document that would have meant execution for all of them if discovered. The pact promised marriage, military support, and restoration. It was treason or salvation, depending on your perspective. Blackheart had done something remarkable. He had given the Golden Company purpose again, without betraying their fundamental identity. They were still exiles planning to return home, still maintaining their traditions and discipline, still honoring the oaths sworn by Bittersteel. But now they had a realistic path forward, a genuine chance of success. He died before seeing his plan executed. The year is uncertain, probably around 296 or 297. His skull joined the others in that tent, positioned prominently as befitted a commander who had changed everything, but the plan survived him. The pieces continued moving, and his successor, a man named Harry Strickland, inherited both an army and a destiny he was not certain he wanted. Homeless Harry, as soldiers called him behind his back, was everything Blackheart was not, cautious where Blackheart was bold, calculating where Blackheart was visionary, a manager rather than a leader. He had been born in exile, grandson of a Golden Company captain, and had never seen Westeros. The dream of return was for him an abstraction rather than a burning need. Yet he wore the commander's chains. He stood in the skull tent with Bittersteel and Blackheart staring at him. And he carried forward a plan that would either fulfill a century of promises or destroy everything the company had built. The conspiracy that Miles Toyne had so carefully constructed continued to develop even after his death, growing more complex and more dangerous with each passing year. At its heart was a simple idea. The Targaryen children needed an army, the Golden Company needed a cause, Dorne needed vengeance. Together these elements could remake the political landscape of Westeros. But as with all grand schemes, implementation proved far more complicated than theory. Prince Doran Martell of Dorne was the most cautious conspirator imaginable, which made him simultaneously the most valuable and most frustrating. His sister Elia had been married to Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Her children had been murdered by Gregor Clegane during the sack of King's Landing. Robert Baratheon had essentially rewarded these atrocities by accepting Lannister friendship and marrying Cersei. For Doran, the wound was personal, deep, and festering, but he was a man who thought in decades rather than years. He would wait for the perfect moment, gathering resources and intelligence, refusing to move until success seemed certain. The marriage pact represented Doran's commitment. Marrying his daughter Arianne to Viserys Targaryen would unite houses and provide political legitimacy for an invasion. But Doran insisted on absolute secrecy. No Dornish forces would mobilize until the Golden Company actually landed in Westeros. He would not expose his people to royal reprisal based on promises and possibilities. Show him an army on Dornish soil and he would provide spears. Ask him to commit before then, and he would smile and deflect. Tyrion Maupatis, meanwhile, had taken the young Targaryen exiles under his protection. Viserys and Daenerys lived in his manse in Pentos, eating his food, wearing clothes he provided, entirely dependent on his generosity. For Viserys this was humiliating. He was a prince, or claimed to be, reduced to accepting charity from a merchant. He grew bitter, paranoid, obsessed with his stolen throne in a way that became increasingly pathological. Daenerys was younger, more adaptable, and largely ignored by the conspirators. She was just a girl, a political token to be married off when useful. No one anticipated that she might become significant in her own right. The entire plan revolved around Viserys as the Targaryen claimant, with Daenerys as essentially a spare heir in case something happened to her brother. Then Illyrio made a decision that would cascade into consequences no one predicted. Instead of proceeding with the planned marriage to Arianne Martell, he arranged for Daenerys to marry Khal Drogo, a powerful Dothraki warlord. The logic seemed sound at the time. Drogo commanded 40,000 mounted warriors. If they could be persuaded to cross the narrow sea, they would be an unstoppable force. The Golden Company, with 10,000 disciplined soldiers combined with 40,000 Dothraki riders, would crush any opposition in Westeros. The marriage took place. Daenerys, 13 years old, was given to Drogo. Viserys followed them into the Dothraki Sea, increasingly unhinged, waiting for the Khalasar to sail for Westeros. But Dothraki do not sail. They fear the ocean, call it the poison water. Drogo showed no interest in crossing to some foreign land to fight for a throne he did not understand and did not care about. Viserys' behavior deteriorated until Drogo executed him in front of the entire Khalasar. The plan to restore House Targaryen was built around Viserys. With him dead, the conspiracy should have collapsed. Daenerys was now the only living Targaryen, but she was pregnant with Drogo's child, embedded in Dothraki culture, seemingly lost to the cause. Except Illyrio had been developing a contingency, a backup plan, that he revealed to Harry Strickland and the Golden Company leadership with impeccable timing. There was another Targaryen, a boy, hidden and protected for 15 years. His name was Aegon, supposedly the son of Prince Rhaegar and Illyria Martell. History recorded that Aegon had been murdered as an infant during the sack of King's Landing, his head smashed against a wall by Gregor Clegane. But Illyrio claimed the child had been switched before the attack. A peasant baby died in his place. The real Aegon had been smuggled out of the city and raised in hiding. The boy's guardian was Jon Connington, who had been posing as a sellsword captain named Griff. Connington's history added credibility to the story. He had been Hand of the King to Aerys II before Robert's rebellion. His great failure was the Battle of the Bells, where he had Robert Baratheon trapped in Stony Sept but lost him because Connington showed mercy to civilians instead of burning the town. Eris stripped him of lands and titles, forcing him into exile. For John Connington, restoring Rhaegar's son was both political goal and personal redemption. Young Griff, as he was called before the revelation of his supposed true identity, had been raised carefully. He was trained by multiple tutors. Scepter Lemore taught him faith and ethics. Haldorn Hofmeister taught him history, languages and mathematics. Duck, a grizzled knight, taught him swordplay and horsemanship. John Connington oversaw everything, determined to craft the perfect prince, the boy who would reclaim his birthright. The question that haunted this revelation was simple. Was it true? Was this boy really Aegon VI Targaryen, son of Rhaegar, or was he a pretender, perhaps Illyrio's son, with his late wife Sarah, who some whispered carried Blackfire blood? The evidence was ambiguous. The boy had purple eyes and silver gold hair, but so did many in Essos with Valyrian ancestry. No one could definitively prove he was who Illyrio claimed. Interestingly, the Golden Company accepted him without significant protest. Harry Strickland and the other captains looked at this boy and agreed to support his claim. For a company founded to fight Targaryens, their quick acceptance seemed suspicious. Some historians believe they knew he was actually a Blackfire and were finally serving their original cause again. Others argue they simply needed a figurehead and did not care about bloodline verification. Still others believe the story completely and think the company had genuinely switched allegiances after a century of failure. Whatever the truth, the conspiracy had a new center. Young Aegon would be presented as the rightful Targaryen heir. He would marry his aunt Daenerys when she returned from the east, uniting their claims. The Golden Company would provide the military might. Dorne would provide political legitimacy and additional forces. Together they would overthrow the Lannister-Baratheon regime and restore House Targaryen. The plan was patient, carefully constructed, built on years of secret negotiations and preparations. It required coordination across thousands of miles between multiple parties with their own agendas. It depended on Daenerys surviving and returning from Essos. It assumed Westeros would remain divided and weak enough for an invasion to succeed. What it did not account for was Tyrion Lannister. The Imper, as he was mockingly called, would arrive in their midst fleeing murder charges in Westeros. And he would say exactly the right words to exactly the right person to shatter the careful timeline and force a premature invasion that would change everything. In the year 300 after Aegon's conquest, a dwarf with mismatched eyes sat playing Savas with a boy who claimed to be a king. Neither of them realized they were about to alter the course of history. Tyrion Lannister had fled Westeros after murdering his father, Tywin, with a crossbow in the privy. It was perhaps the most undignified death a man of Tywin's stature could suffer, which made it somehow appropriate. Tyrion had been caught by Jorah Mormont, the exiled knight, who was attempting to deliver him to Daenerys Targaryen in Meereen. But John Connington had intercepted them on the Royne River, bringing both Tyrion and Jorah aboard the Shy Maid. The boat was cramped quarters for an interesting collection of people. Griff, who was actually John Connington. Young Griff, who was supposedly Aegon Targaryen. Lemore the Scepter, Haldon the Maester, Duck the Knight, and now Tyrion, a wanted kingslayer with one of the sharpest minds in Westeros and absolutely nothing to lose. Tyrion recognized John Connington almost immediately. The former hand's attempt at disguise was competent but not perfect, and Tyrion had always made it his business to know the players in the great game. If Griff was John Connington, and John Connington was traveling with a purple-eyed boy of the right age, then the implications were staggering. Either this was truly Rhaegar's son, somehow saved from the sack of King's Landing, or it was an elaborate fraud. Either way, it was dangerous and fascinating in equal measure. Young Griff was being groomed with obvious care. Every aspect of his education had been calculated to produce the perfect prince. He could speak multiple languages, knew history and law, could fight competently, if not brilliantly. But he had never faced real adversity. He had been protected, sheltered, told repeatedly that he was destined for greatness. It made him simultaneously capable and fragile. Tyrion engaged the boy in Sub-Ace, that complex strategy game, beloved by nobles and merchants across Essos. They played several rounds. Tyrion won some, lost others, but more importantly, he studied his opponent, watched how Aegon reacted to setbacks, noted the flash of frustration when a piece was captured, the surge of pride when he executed a clever move. The boy was intelligent but inexperienced, skilled but untested, confident but insecure. And Tyrion, who had spent a lifetime manipulating people because it was the only weapon a dwarf could reliably wield, began to play a far more dangerous game than Saivas. He spoke casually about Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen, as she was being called. She had hatched 3 dragons from stone eggs, the first dragons seen in the world in over a century. She had conquered Astapor, freed the Unsullied, sacked Yunkai. She was currently ruling Meereen, attempting to abolish slavery throughout Slavers Bay. She was, by any measure, the most significant Targaryen in generations. The original plan called for Aegon to wait, to remain hidden, until Daenerys returned to Westeros with her dragons. Then they would marry, unite their claims, present a combined force that would be unstoppable. Patience was the watchword. The conspiracy had been built on patience, but Tyrion began asking questions. Innocent-seeming questions that planted seeds of doubt. How long was Aegon supposed to wait? Daenerys showed no signs of leaving Meereen. She was playing queen in a foreign city, dealing with internal politics, seemingly content to rule pyramids and freedmen. Meanwhile, Westeros was tearing itself apart. The War of the Five Kings had left the realm exhausted and divided. Tommen Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, but he was a child controlled by his mother Cersei. The Starks were destroyed. Stannis was defeated. The realm had never been weaker. Why should a king wait for permission from an aunt he had never met? Why should the son of Rhaegar, the rightful heir, play second to a girl conquering cities across the sea? The implication hung in the air, like poison. If Aegon waited, he would always be secondary to Daenerys. She had dragons. She had a legend. She was becoming a myth. By the time she returned, if she returned, Aegon would be the one asking to share her glory, rather than offering to share his. But if he went to Westeros now, if he took advantage of the chaos, if he proved himself in battle and conquest, then he would be the established king when Daenerys arrived. She would be the one coming to him, perhaps grateful for the marriage alliance, certainly in a weaker negotiating position. From a strategic standpoint, from the perspective of a man who actually wanted power, rather than just talked about deserving it, the logic was compelling. Tyrion presented these arguments with the skill of a master advocate. He never directly told Aegon what to do. He simply asked questions, raised possibilities, pointed out considerations that the careful tutors had probably avoided. And he did it all while Jon Connington listened with growing alarm and growing temptation. Because Jon Connington had a secret that made Tyrion's words resonate with terrible force. He had grayscale, the stone disease that turned flesh to rigid dead matter. There was no cure. The infection was spreading up his arm, would eventually reach his chest and heart, would kill him slowly and horribly. He might have years. He might have months, but he did not have the luxury of infinite patience. Jon Connington had failed Rhaegar at the Battle of the Bells. That failure haunted every moment of his exile. He had been given a second chance with Rhaegar's son, a possibility of redemption, but redemption required Aegon on the Iron Throne, and Jon would not live forever. The idea of dying before seeing his prince crowned was intolerable. Tyrion's arguments about striking now, about not waiting, about seizing opportunity, spoke directly to Connington's desperate urgency. The debate aboard the Shy Maid lasted days. Aegon was young and could be swayed by appeals to pride and ambition. Connington was dying and could be swayed by appeals to urgency and legacy. The other tutors were more cautious, but they were not making the final decisions. Slowly, inexorably, the plan that had been built on patience began to transform into something impulsive and dangerous. When they reached the Golden Company, when Aegon and Connington presented the revised strategy to Harry Strickland and the other captains, the reception was mixed. Strickland particularly was horrified. The company was currently under contract to Volantis. They had been paid, had given their word, were bound by the very oath that defined their identity. To abandon that contract would destroy the reputation they had spent over a century building. But Aegon insisted. This was the moment. Westeros would never be weaker. The Golden Company had been founded to return home. Well, here was the chance. Were they going to let it pass because of a contract to defend some free city in a war that barely mattered? The captains debated in the Skull Tent, surrounded by their gilded predecessors. What would Bittersteel do? He would go home. He would seize any opportunity to return to Westeros. But he would never break his word. The oath to honor contracts was as fundamental as the oath to return home. For the first time in the company's history, their two core principles were in direct conflict. Harry Strickland stood among the skulls, feeling the weight of their hollow stares, and made the decision that would define his entire tenure as Captain General. They would break the contract. They would betray Volantis. They would destroy everything the Golden Company represented for a chance at something it had always represented. The vote was close, with many captains deeply unhappy, but the decision was made. The Golden Company would go home. After 112 years, they would finally honor the oath that Bittersteel had sworn in exile. And they would do it by breaking the oath that Bittersteel had created to make them survive long enough to go home. Some contracts are written in ink, some are written in blood, and when they conflict, you discover which one truly matters. The day the Golden Company broke their contract with Volantis, something died. Not a person, though there would be plenty of death to come. What died was an idea, the concept that had elevated them above every other sellsword company in Essos, the principle that their word was absolute, that once given it could be trusted without question, that contracts mattered more than profit or convenience, that died. And in its place was born something older and perhaps more fundamental, the dream of exiles finally going home. Volantis was shocked and furious. They had paid handsomely for the Golden Company's services. Treaties were signed. Oaths were sworn. The company was supposed to be defending against threats from rival free cities. Instead, the golden banners came down. The camps were struck. The elephants were loaded onto ships. And 10,000 soldiers who had promised to fight for Volantis sailed away, leaving the city vulnerable and betrayed. The news spread across Essos like wildfire, through dry grass. The Golden Company, famous for never breaking faith, had abandoned a contract mid-term. Magisters and princes who had relied on their reputation questioned everything. If the Golden Company could break their word, who could be trusted? The very concept of binding mercenary contracts became suspect. Other sellsword companies faced immediate skepticism from potential employers. The Golden Company had not just destroyed their own reputation, they had damaged the entire mercenary system. But the soldiers boarding those ships did not care about Essosi politics or damaged reputations. They were going to Westeros. After a century of exile, after generations of waiting, after so many failed rebellions and dashed hopes, they were actually sailing for the Seven Kingdoms. Old men wept openly. Veterans who had given their lives to the company without ever expecting to see this day stood at the rails, staring west toward a horizon that held more than ocean. It held home. For the younger soldiers, the ones born in Pentos or Mai, who had never seen Westeros, the emotions were more complicated. This was a foreign land they were invading. Yes, they had been raised on stories of castles and keeps, taught that this was their true homeland, but it felt abstract. They were following orders, maintaining traditions, honoring oaths made by ancestors they never knew. Some were excited. Others were terrified. All of them understood they were crossing a line from which there was no return. The fleet was substantial. Dozens of ships purchased or commandeered, enough to transport 10,000 men with their equipment and supplies. The war elephants alone required specially reinforced vessels, platforms built to handle their massive weight and constant movement. Horses, siege weapons, armor, tents, the entire apparatus of a mobile army had to cross the narrow sea. Harry Strickland commanded from the largest ship, surrounded by his officers, trying not to show the doubt that gnawed at him constantly. He had broken the Golden Company's sacred oath. He had destroyed their most valuable asset. If this invasion failed, if they could not establish themselves in Westeros, they would have nothing. No reputation in Essos, no home in Westeros, just exile and dishonor. The crossing took days. The weather was favorable, which some took as a good sign. Others remembered that the Third Blackfire Rebellion had been destroyed by storms at sea. The gods were fickle. Fortune could turn in moments. But the ships pressed on, carried by winds that seemed to push them toward destiny or doom. They did not sail for the western coast, where they might have landed near the Reach or Westerlands. Instead, they approached from the east, targeting the Stormlands. This was deliberate strategy. The Stormlands had historically shown Targaryen sympathies. More importantly, it was Robert Baratheon's homeland, and with Robert dead, Stannis far away in the north, and Renly long since murdered, the region lacked strong leadership. Local lords were confused, divided, uncertain of their allegiances in the chaos following the War of the Five Kings. The first target was Griffin's Roost, the ancestral seat of House Connington. John Connington had been stripped of his lands and titles by Aerys II. The castle had been given to lesser cousins who held it without distinction. Taking it back was both strategic and deeply personal for Connington. This was his home, his father's hall, the place he had been forced to abandon in disgrace. The attack came at night. The Golden Company landed in small boats, climbing the cliffs below the castle with the skill of professional soldiers who had done this 100 times. The garrison was unprepared. Griffin's Roost had not faced serious military threat in decades. The sentries on the walls died quietly, throats cut by infiltrators. Gates were opened from within. The main force poured through like water breaking a dam. It was over before sunrise. The keep fell with minimal casualties on either side. The Connington cousins who had held the castle surrendered when they realized resistance was suicide. John Connington stood in the great hall of his ancestors for the first time in over 15 years. He ran his hand along the stone walls, touched the high table where his father had sat. Grayscale was spreading up his arm, hidden beneath his glove. He was dying, but he was home. Golden Company banners rose over Griffin's Roost. The golden skulls on black fields snapped in the ocean wind. Soldiers who had spent their entire lives in Essos walked through a Westerosi castle, touching everything with wonder or uncertainty. Some found it strange and foreign. Others felt something they could not name, a connection to place that transcended experience. Young Aegon, the supposed son of Rhaegar, the prince who would be king, took command with surprising confidence. He addressed the soldiers, thanked them for their loyalty, promised them lands and titles when he sat the Iron Throne. He looked the part, silver gold hair, purple eyes, handsome and young and charismatic. Whether he was truly Rhaegar's son or Illyrio's trained pretender, he acted like a king. The campaign began in earnest. The Golden Company was not a raiding force or a guerrilla army. They were 10,000 professional soldiers with clear objectives. They moved quickly, striking at small keeps and isolated holdfasts. Lords who bent the knee were allowed to keep their lands. Those who resisted found their castles under siege by war elephants that smashed gates and walls with almost contemptuous ease. The Stormlands fell piece by piece. Rainhouse, Crow's Nest, Greenstone, Honestimont. The Golden Company's reputation preceded them. Many lords, uncertain of their position in the larger political landscape, chose to surrender rather than fight. Better to bend the knee to a Targaryen prince, even a questionable one, than die defending a throne held by a Lannister child king. Ravens flew to King's Landing, carrying news of the invasion. Cersei Lannister, ruling as Queen Regent for her son Tommen, initially dismissed the reports. Another pretender with a small army. The realm had seen several during the War of the Five Kings. Cersei had larger concerns, her political enemies in King's Landing, the Faith militant causing trouble, the constant pressure from every direction. By the time Cersei realized this was a serious military threat, the Golden Company had secured a significant foothold. They held a dozen castles. They controlled ports and supply lines. They had a professional army that dwarfed anything the Stormlords could muster. And they had something no pretender had possessed in living memory: war elephants. The psychological impact of elephants cannot be overstated. Soldiers in Westeros had heard of them in stories, had seen them perhaps in traveling menageries, but facing them in battle was entirely different. The trumpeting roar that shook the air, the ground trembling under their massive feet, the sight of arrows bouncing off their armored hides. Men broke and ran before the elephants even reached their lines. Jon Connington drove the campaign with obsessive intensity. His grayscale was spreading. He could feel it creeping across his chest now, the flesh hardening, sensation dying. He hid it from everyone, wore long sleeves and gloves always, avoided physical contact, but time was running out. He needed to see Aegon crowned. He needed to achieve the redemption that had eluded him for over a decade. The Golden Company, for all their skill and discipline, felt the strangeness of their position. They were home. They had fulfilled the oath that defined them. But in doing so, they had broken the oath that made them who they were. Some found peace in finally standing on Westerosi soil. Others felt they had traded everything meaningful for a gamble that might still fail. In the skull tent, now erected in Griffin's Roost, the gilded heads of past commanders watched silently. What would Bittersteel say? Would he celebrate the return or condemn the broken contract? No one could answer that question. They could only move forward. The invasion had begun. The Golden Company had burned their bridges. Now they would conquer or die trying. History will debate the Golden Company for as long as scholars study the complexities of honor, loyalty, and the price of exile. They were Selhus who elevated themselves above their profession through sheer force of will. They were exiles who refused to let displacement become dissolution. They were oath keepers who became oath breakers for the sake of a deeper oath. And they were, ultimately, a testament to the terrible power of intergenerational purpose. Consider what they achieved. A bastard son, denied his birthright and consumed by bitterness, fled across the narrow sea with nothing but a stolen sword and unquenchable fury. From that foundation of rage and loss, he built an institution that survived him by nearly 60 years. The Golden Company outlasted its founder, outlasted the cause it was created to serve, outlasted empires and dynasties. For 112 years, it maintained standards that should have been impossible for mercenaries to uphold. The paradox sits at the heart of their story. They became legendary for never breaking contracts, then destroyed that legend to fulfill their founding purpose. Which oath mattered more? The recent one, given to Volantis, backed by gold and law, or the ancient one, sworn by bitter steel in exile, written in blood and bitter memory? They chose the blood oath. They chose home over honor, or perhaps they believed that returning home was the truest honor of all. The skull tent remains the most haunting symbol of their legacy. Over 100 commanders, their heads gilded and preserved, watching eternally over decisions made by the living. Each skull represented a man who died in service to a dream. Some fell in battle against Westerosi forces. Others died in Associ wars that had nothing to do with Blackfire or Targaryen. Some died of disease or age, waiting for a return that never came in their lifetime. All of them believed, or tried to believe, that their sacrifice mattered, that they were part of something larger than sellsword gold and mercenary reputation. Did they die for nothing? The question haunts evaluation of the Golden Company. If Aegon is truly Rhaegar's son, if he successfully claims the Iron Throne, then perhaps every death was justified. Every year of exile, every broken dream, every skull in that tent was payment toward ultimate victory. But if Aegon is a pretender, if this is just another Blackfire in different clothing, if the invasion ultimately fails, then what were those 100 years for? What did all those men die believing in? The tragedy is that they may never have been fighting for the right cause at all. The Blackfires lost 5 rebellions over 7 decades. Every attempt ended in defeat and death. Yet the Golden Company never questioned whether Blackfire had the right to rule. They simply assumed that loyalty and military skill would eventually triumph. When the male Blackfire line ended, they found another dragon to follow. Perhaps any dragon would do, as long as it gave them purpose and a path home. Bittersteel's ghost dominates this legacy. Everything flows from his refusal to bend the knee at Redgrass Field. His bitterness became policy. His rage became tradition. His oath became institutional identity. Men who never met him, who were born a century after his death, still lived according to principles he established. That kind of influence beyond the grave is rare and terrible. It can create great things or terrible ones, and with the Golden Company, it created both. The broken contract with Volantis represents the clearest moment of choice in their history. For over a century they had argued that honor could exist in a dishonorable profession, that sellswords could be trusted absolutely, that contracts were sacred. Then they abandoned all of it. Some would say they proved that even the Golden Company was just mercenaries in the end, willing to break faith for the right price. Others would argue they proved the opposite, that there was something they valued more than gold, more than reputation, more than the very principle that made them successful. As the story stands in the available histories, the ending remains unwritten. The Golden Company holds territory in the Stormlands. Aegon presents himself as the rightful king. Daenerys Targaryen remains across the sea with 3 dragons. The political situation in Westeros continues to shift like sand in wind. The invasion might succeed or fail. The Golden Company might achieve vindication or destruction. History has not yet delivered its verdict. But regardless of outcome, they accomplished something remarkable. They survived, against all odds, through countless setbacks, across generations of disappointment. They maintained identity and purpose. They proved that exiles could become legends, that displaced nobility could forge new meaning from loss, that an oath sworn in defeat could bind tighter than chains. Beneath the gold, the bitter steel, the motto means more than the contrast between surface and substance. It speaks to the contradiction of trying to maintain honor in dishonorable work, the impossibility of being both mercenary and idealist. The Golden Company lived that contradiction for over a century, and in the end they resolved it by choosing the bitter steel over the gold. Whether that choice leads to triumph or tragedy, whether Aegon sits the Iron Throne or dies in some forgotten battle, the Golden Company has already secured their place in history. They are the army that never broke until it did. The exiles who went home, the keepers of an impossible dream that somehow, against all reason, might actually come true. And in a tent somewhere, 100 gilded skulls watch and wait to see if their deaths meant something after all.